following ventromedial prefrontal cortex damage. It's a huge mouthful. I know when Eric did his presentation on Thursday, they called it the VPC. This article calls it the VMPC. It is the same thing, in case you got confused on that. So for the most part, I really seriously considered just playing the entire first part of Eric's presentation on this, because it is the same exact thing. I almost took a picture of him during his presentation, and then I thought it was too creepy, so we'll actually do real things today. So as a recap, the VMPC, so I don't stutter, is located in the frontal lobe. It's on the medial surface, or it's right here. If you can't tell, it's purple right here. And it is implicated in fear and risk processing. I know a lot of you guys had that in your discussion, but it is, I'll go into this a little bit later, but it has been studied quite a bit in the context of social decision making, in risk taking, and then as far as Eric's presentation on Thursday, the empathy, morality, and basically any just sort of like social situation, because there are social deficits for people that have VMPC damage. They also have an inhibition of emotional responses, like we talked about last time, and the process of decision making, which I feel like I'm just reiterating everything that we just said. But we have.
So let me step in here and say that I added this slide and the next slide to her presentation, because one of the things that drives me the craziest about this field is that the people who study the brain can't get their stuff together and decide what the different parts of the brain are actually called. Okay, so if you want to get frustrated, go on to Google and look up pictures of the VMPFC. I mean, it's like all over the map. About the only thing that's for sure is that it's in the frontal lobe, somewhere up here and down here. So if you compare that to the picture before, Sally, if you could go back, look at that. So that they're basically saying the bottom part of this purple area is the VMPFC. Just the bottom part. Who knows how big that is, really? It's just pointing to the purple. Now go to the next one. Do you see, I mean, look at that. It goes all the way down to the bottom and back. And then this is a tiny bit of it showing on the bottom of the cortex. So who the hell knows where it is? Now, also notice that this one basically says that if you combine those two things, that's the VMPFC. They call those two orbitofrontal cortex. Both of those colors are orbitofrontal cortex. Combined, they make the VMPFC. Okay, then go to the next one. And then this one doesn't say anything about the actual medial surface, which is its ventromedial, folks. That means it's on the medial surface of the hemisphere. You'd never know that from looking at this, okay? So now that I've had my rant, this is my morning rant, I'm finished, so you can move forward.
Well, I mean, she's right. If you look at the three different pictures, it's all completely different for the most part. These two are a ventral view, so it's kind of like you're looking up from this angle of it, so you want to think about it being kind of just right above the eye sockets, if that makes a little bit, well, on some of these.
In the middle.
Yeah.
In the middle. Not on the outer part, that's orbitofrontal.
Right.
Except for if you're in picture number 2.
Just go back and forth this whole presentation.
Somewhere in there, it's messed up.
Well, okay, so in the context of the article talks a lot about social pressure. What do you guys think social pressure is exactly?
It's what I'm giving you right now to answer this question.
Yes.
I mean, it's basically like the influence one person has over another person is
Yeah, pretty much. Actually, there's a lot of different definitions of social pressure. There's also a lot of whether or not social pressure is the same thing as peer pressure. And in the context of this article, it's not supposed to be the same thing. But so in just like a random internet search, this one's from Wikipedia, this one says the influence that is exerted on a person or group by another person or group. It includes rational argument, persuasion, conformity, and demands. And I also super love that it says social force, because I just imagine this like Darth Vader creature, like, you're gonna do this, and just like walking around. But that's Wikipedia. And this one, I want to say Psychology Today. This one thinks that peer pressure and social pressure are the same thing, and this one is focusing more on changing attitudes and values. We have, this one is a dictionary definition, also same thing, peer pressure is the same thing as social pressure. And this is a behavior-related one. And this last one I got actually from a religious website. I thought it'd be interesting to see what they think social pressure is. This one actually is so far one of the best definitions though, because it includes emotions, criticisms, all of that, and how it can kind of control other people, micro and macro. So thank you, religious websites. But overall, in the context of this article, social pressure, the way that they define it is any sort of pressure that would make you think of what is immediate versus what is in the future. So in the article, they talk about the driving task. And the immediate threat or the immediate thing that's going on in the context of social pressure is there is honking. The long-term goal is to make a safe left turn. So social pressure in the context of this article is talking about anything that would make you think, I want to disregard my future goals and think about the immediate goals, which is to relieve social pressure or relieve any sort of like annoyance of honking, I guess, in this context. Does that make sense? Okay, so I talked a little bit about social decision making. There have been most of the evidence in social decision making in the BMPC is from like 2001 or before. But I did find a meta-analysis that went into it a little bit. Most of this, lower feelings of guilt, less pro-social behavior, trust and trustworthy behavior, and impairment in making decisions that involve the future but not immediate consequences, like I said, was based off of an experiment that they did, I want to say it was 1997. And they basically had participants, they had brain damage participants, a control with neurotypical participants, and participants with VMPC damage. And they had them play 3 economic games, is what they called them. So the first one they called it the dictator game. And basically what they had them do is they had the participant, whatever group they happened to be in, they have 50 points or $50, and they were told at the end of this experiment that the points would transfer into dollar amounts, basically. But they had $50 or points, and they were told that they can distribute between this anonymous person. You can give as much of it as you want to this other person and keep the rest of it yourself. And they reported how much that they kept for themselves and how much they gave to other people. The second thing that they did was called the ultimatum game. And the ultimatum game is they sat across from another person, and they had the same thing, 50 points or dollars in this case, and they played it twice. Once as the person that was distributing the points, and once as the person that was accepting the points. And the person that was distributing the points, same thing, as much as they wanted to give to the other person, and they could keep as much as they wanted, but the second person that was accepting could either accept or reject the points. If they accepted it, then they accepted it. If they rejected it, then nobody would get anything. So if I gave you 15 points and I kept the remaining 35 for myself, and you said, no, like no deal, I don't want that, then nobody gets anything. And if you accept it, then yes.
Did the person getting the money know how much money was being divided up? Okay.
Yes, it was like a physical, like, I'm going to hand you, like poker chips, for example. Like, I'm going to hand you this exact amount. You can choose to say, no, I don't want this, and nobody gets anything. Or, yes, I want it, and that's exactly what you get. The third game that they called it the trust game. And there were 3 people involved in this game. There's an anonymous person in it. I don't really know what their point of being in it is. But there's 2 roles, one of them being the investor, and the other one's called the trustee. And it was the same thing of the 50 points being distributed, and the investor would put, let me make sure I get this right because I got it wrong when I was, okay, so they divide a certain amount of points up however they want to. The other person doesn't, the trustee doesn't know at first how many points the other person has allotted them. The trustee can say, okay, I trust you, and I will take what I'm given. And in that case, in that case, everything's evenly split. Or I'm sorry, that's if they say, I don't trust you. I don't trust you. I don't think that you gave me half or what I think I deserve. And in that case, it's split equally. If they say, okay, I do trust you, then the stake is doubled. And the person, the investor, can say, okay, now that the stake is doubled, I can change it. I can choose to either divide it equally, the new amount, or I can, what they call betrayal. I can leave you that original half and then take the other half of the doubled stake for myself. Does that make sense? It's a little bit, it's kind of hard to explain. So that last one is anyway. And what they found based on this task is people with VMPC damage in general were less likely to trust. They were, as far as the dictator game and the ultimatum game, they were less likely to show any sort of guilt over. They gave less to the other person no matter what. So if I think out of the 50 points, their average was 4.7. It was $4.7 or chips that people with VMPC damage would give to the other person, as opposed to I think it was 25 or 27 for people that didn't have the damage, which is still pretty low, but in this case it was a dictator type of thing. Yeah, okay, good point.
Pretty good.
I was thinking of the double stake thing. Yeah, but I just thought it was funny that it's 4.7 of all things.
That's terrible.
Yeah, they were less likely to trust the other person when they were the trustee, and they were more likely to say, if they were the investor and the other person trusted them, they were more likely to do the betrayal thing of okay, you trusted me, but I'm still not going to give you half of my doubled stake. So in general, and this is encompassed in the article also, they found that there was an impairment in making decisions that involved the future but not immediate. So whatever the most immediate goal was, if I get things right now, it's more important than if I get something in the future. So if I can give myself 50 chips or points or whatever it is right now, or they can't trust you to do it. Sorry, I'm trying to think of a better way to explain this. Okay, like a lottery thing. So they're more likely to say, okay, I want to take $5 million right now as opposed to $10 million in 10 days. Or doesn't matter whether it's a reward or a consequence. They're more likely to engage in riskier behavior if they get a reward right that moment than if they have a significantly worse consequence, even if it's just 2 or 3 days in the future. Any sort of, yes?
Go ahead, you finish your sentence.
Oh, any sort of consequence that's in the future or reward that's in the future, they're less likely to be interested in, and it's less likely to affect their decision making.
So that sounds like they were extreme delayed discounters. So they totally discounted delayed rewards and punishments and only cared about the ones that they could get
Pretty much.
right away. So that's a delayed discounting. You guys probably have heard of this at least somewhere, so you should have, but if not, you should look into it because it's interesting. One other question I had about this, when you kept saying points or dollars, did they actually have cash dollars, or was it always chips or something that represented dollars?
It was something that represented them, and they were told at the end of the task that they were going to, the amount of chips that they had would be
right, like in a
exchanged.
casino.
Exactly.
The reason I ask that is because there's research with chimpanzees showing that chimpanzees are able to delay gratification, in other words, delayed discount, if they're using abstract representations of reward, but if you give them actual food rewards, they can't restrain themselves. So they have the ability to kind of put off rewards when they're abstract, like, money as opposed to actual food for a chimp. So I was wondering if they had manipulated that.
Yeah, no, it was just in the.
Just so
in the
even with
context of
points,
it.
they still can't.
Yeah, they had no concept of delayed gratification at all. Okay. So this brings me to social disparity, which the article talks very, very briefly about in the beginning. And social disparity is defined as, by the encyclopedia anyway, a great difference in how an individual interprets their social standing in relation to another's. So basically, how I perceive myself in relation to you or a group of people. And it has been found to be directly related to social pressure. Does anybody know why it would be directly related to social pressure?
Would disparity being like a bad thing, like you're beneath?
Not necessarily.
Or
Disparity
above?
just means difference.
Okay.
If you can perceive yourself as, you can have a social disparity in that you perceive yourself to be at a much higher standard or a different level than somebody else.
Would you expect the effect on social pressure to be different depending on the direction of that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it, you can look at the group that you're up against as either being beneath you, and so their pressure wouldn't have such a direct effect on you. And if you feel that you're possibly beneath them, it would have more so of an immediate effect on you to conform to whatever is going on.
Yeah. Did you have something different?
I was going to say something along that lines. It's sort of like power distance dynamics to things. So like if you perceive someone as having some sort of authority over you, their pressure may be like more enhanced with someone you feel like you have authority over. So
Yeah, definitely.
I was going to say it's exactly what they're saying, but most people like to not necessarily conform to what everyone else is doing, but they don't like to be different either. They don't want to stand out. So it should be related to social pressure because you want to be equivalent to what everyone else is doing.
Okay, that's a good way to think about that.
So that's a different kind of disparity that you're talking about. It's like, this seems to be about like health disparity. So I have the option to go, I have insurance, so I can get good health care if people who have insurance can't. So this is kind of like that, but you're talking about just being different from the people around you, so there's a disparity between you, but it's not like a class disparity or a... It wasn't clear to me what they even meant. I spent
Yeah,
a long
that's why I
time trying
had
to figure it out.
I had to go into it a lot.
I think
too.
that might have been kind of a, well, anyway.
Yeah, mostly I started looking into it originally because I
Mhm.
thought maybe it was like something that they mislabeled
Mhm.
or that they were just not being clear about what they meant by something, and that's why I went into it.
But you did find the one article on volleyball or something. What was that? No, I'm sorry.
That one,
Music popularity. That's what
yeah,
it was.
music popularity in general, and that has a lot to do with what you were just talking about. That particular article talked about not so much whether you were below or above somebody. It had a lot to do with the music. Okay, so one particular song is super popular. Let's say Britney Spears right now is super popular. And I don't know why Britney Spears came to mind. But let's say she's super popular right now. Everyone that you know is listening to them. You are, it depends on the degree of disparity, how large you feel like that gap is. So if you are kind of indifferent, like you don't really care about Britney Spears, you're less likely to feel like you need to conform to that than if you were just like, God, like I can't, like I have no idea what I'm doing with this, I don't want to listen to her, I don't have anything to do with this, I've never heard her, any sort of like really strong disparity, they're more likely to kind of push themselves up after being told that they're like their peers or people that they respect, people that they like, people that they hang around, anything like that, are super into Britney Spears in this scenario. Does that make sense? So this entire article had more to do with the size of the gap than the actual, whether it was beneath or below or anything like that. That was, it was a weird article.
Yeah, that is weird.
It was a super weird article. But what I found anyway is that a person's ability to detect social disparity influences very much changes how you see the social pressure in a situation to change. So if you think that there is a very large social disparity, meaning there's a very large difference between where you see yourself and where you see a different person, then you are more likely to think that there is significantly more social pressure than there actually is. Whereas if you feel like the social disparity, the difference between you and another person is very small, then you're likely to think, well, I mean, I know they want me to do something else, but we're really not that different, so maybe our views are closer than I think we are, or something along those lines. So I know there was one person in their discussion that mentioned this last part right here. In the article, it talks about research in the amygdala and the ventral striatum based on the bold response. I can't remember who, I have it over here somewhere. But, so the amygdala and the ventral striatum have in different research shown to be related to the VMPC as far as it's connected in some way, mostly in decision making. And the amygdala and the ventral striatum, I don't know why I'm having a hard time saying ventral striatum, are associated with the processing of social disparity. So when you're trying to think about how different is this group from my group or this person from this person, you have a lot of activation in the amygdala and ventral striatum, which is kind of what led, that area anyway, is what kind of led these researchers to think that maybe the VMPC might have something to do with social pressure and social disparity. So, self-regulation, also very related. What do you think social regulation is, or self-regulation? If you're trying to regulate yourself, what are you doing?
You're trying to control yourself.
Trying to control yourself.
Speak up. Go ahead.
Are you saying like one's level of inhibition?
Level of what, sorry?
Inhibition.
Inhibition, yeah.
I think it's like everything, like being aware of your behaviors and your thoughts and your emotions, and just like being able to control that in the context or situation that you're in.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you repeat that out loud?
She said, well, I don't want to mess up your
No.
wording. Do you want to say it again, or do you want me to paraphrase you?
Go
What would you
ahead.
prefer me to do?
Go ahead.
She said being able to basically self-monitor yourself, your thoughts, your emotions. Yes.
I would add to that saying that like to ensure that it's appropriate for like the social situation that you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. In the context of this article, that's super important, being able to regulate what is socially appropriate for you to be doing. So, does anybody have anything else before I? Okay, so self-regulation has a lot to do with the influence of the external environment on you. If you are very good at self-regulation, you are very good at self-monitoring. That's one of those things that I found was very synonymous with self-regulation. Self-monitoring being able to reflect on yourself and say, like, these are my thoughts, these are my actions, these are my beliefs. This is my life and I have control over it. So another, police oneself, I don't know why I was stuck on that phrase when I wrote this. But like I said, being able to judge your own behavior in relation to your personal standards and the environment around you. Self-efficacy and personal agency. Does anybody know what personal agency is? That's something that's not necessarily thrown around as much.
It's an attribution of like what you are doing or capable of doing versus what somebody else has done or what something else has done.
Yeah, exactly. Personal agency. I'm having a hard time speaking today, guys. Personal agency has a lot to do with your purposes and your ability to think yourself capable of things and think yourself capable of regulating yourself in this context, I guess. But the better your self-efficacy, meaning how well you perceive your own ability, and your personal agency, how much you can take credit for the things that you're doing, the better your ability to self-regulate. Because if you're able to say, I know I can do these things, I know I'm responsible for these things that I've done, and I know that I am capable of doing these things for myself, the more that you can monitor yourself and say, these are my thoughts, these are my behaviors, this is my life that I'm controlling. And the better that you self-regulate, the more aware that you are of your own internal state, that's self-monitoring, and the more likely you are to contribute in a social situation. So this little Dick Kramer article that I won't go much into, but sorry,
That's,
I
no,
know
it's
it's a
not
little,
you,
it's an awkward angle.
That thing.
But if you have basically what Dick Kramer and colleagues found was that the higher that you rate yourself in terms of self-monitoring, the more that you feel that you are capable of monitoring your own internal environment relative to the external environment, the more likely you are to, in like say a gambling task, want to be socially active with the other people in the task. The more likely that you are to want to help the other people in a task. The more likely you are to want to be in a group and be a little bit more pro-social in general, like working for the betterment of the group, is what they found. And they did a little bit of a little blurb at the end of the article about VMPC. And people with VMPC did have a slight difference. They thought it was more because it was a social thing. There's a lot of research to say that VMPC just generally damages your social appearance, if I could not press buttons. So that's a very broad overview of that. So going to the current article, we have the research question: does the ventromedial prefrontal cortex have an impact on the response to the negative social pressure? So does the VMPC impact your ability to act under any sort of terms of pressure, especially it being social being the key thing in this, because VMPC damaged individuals tend to have more issues in social situations. So, oh, that was a weird transition. They had two hypotheses. Participants with VMPC damage would show lower ability to resist social pressure compared to the participants without VMPC damage. So basically they would be more likely to conform to social pressure. Participants with VMPC damage would show poor regulation of negative emotion under social pressure. So that was them saying that they thought they would have a higher response on that skin conductance response, and which to them meant that they were showing a stronger emotional reaction to the social pressure. If you remember from I can't remember which other article had the skin conductance response, but the skin conductance response, basically what it is it has two electrodes. One of them is at the base of your thumb and the other one's at the top of a finger, and it measures the conductance between the two electrodes. And it's like a sweat response, basically. The more that you sweat, the more you have a little electrolytes and stuff like that in your sweat, and it makes it more conductive. So that's how it measures your sweat and your emotional response to something, basically.
What do you know what the actual part of the nerve system is that it's indexing?
The skin conductance response?
It's the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Most of our organs are dually innervated by the parasympathetic and sympathetic branch, but interestingly, the sweat glands are only innervated by the sympathetic branch. So when you get excited or sympathetically aroused by anything, they send out a little to your sweat glands, and a tiny bit of sweat is emitted. Not necessarily onto the surface of the skin, but so that's why it's such a good measurement of sympathetic nervous system activation, because it's not innervated by the other side, so it's kind of a pure measure. So basically what they're saying is these people were really, when you get a big SCR, it's because you're sympathetically activated, which is fight or flight. It's a weird thing. Never mind. I mean, I could go on for like 3 years about this, and you really do not want to hear it. It's not that interesting.
Okay, well, that's the skin conductance response. Every so often I'll refer to it as the SCR in here. If you get confused, that's skin conductance response. So the participants, the NC is basically the group of participants that is the control participants that had no neurological damage whatsoever. They were neurologically typical. There were 14 of them that were age matched to the other two participant groups, and they had no history of neurological disease. The brain damage compare group, that's what BDC is in this context, there's 12 of them. They all had brain damage, but they were all outside of the VMPFC. Sorry, it confused me that there was an extra letter for a second. the participants, there were 3 of them that had a benign tumor resection, meaning that there was a benign tumor. There was a tumor that was not malignant, it was not cancerous, it was not metastatic or like doing something really crazy in the brain that was removed. Hemorrhagic, I can't say that word.
Hemorrhagic.
I don't know why I can't say that. That word, stroke.
It has a weird H in it.
Maybe that's what it is. Maybe it like trips me up, that H. Which I hope you guys remember what that and ischemic strokes are as far as the blood vessels in the brain bursting or having buildup of some kind. The group that had VMPFC damage, there were 11 of them. 9 of them had bilateral, meaning that they had damage on both sides of the brain, and 2 unilateral, meaning there was only damage on one side of the brain, on one hemisphere of the brain. 6 of those had the benign tumor resection, the removal of the tumor that was not malignant, and 5 of them had that fun stroke word that I can't say. Hemorrhagic.
There you go.
Okay. Let's see if I can say it later though. So basically what they did is they had a left turn decision task and they had them in this super intense driving simulator. I think it was like a 1994 Saturn that they had them in, and basically, and I'll have a slide on this, but they had 180 degrees of screens in the front and then 50 degrees of rotation in the back, I think is what it said. So basically, if any of the mirrors that you looked in, you could see this like simulation, and they had this just like drive safety simulation. It was kind of cool. This is at the University of Iowa. And they also had auditory input. They had the whole 9 yards, and it was a rural intersection. So they had, and I'll go back to that slide, but they have the subject right here, and the subject's making a left turn onto the street, onto a rural intersection. In the control condition, there's no honking vehicle, and vehicles are just coming towards them in this direction. And the gaps between the vehicles vary on a pattern, and there's, I can't remember how many patterns, and they vary it for each individual. I think there's 140 something, I can't remember the exact number, of different gaps that a participant can choose. They were chose to choose 10. And when they chose it, they had this like lever that they would pull, indicating that they would go at that point. But yeah, there's different amounts of intervals, and this is a really terrible, these are both from the article. This is a really terrible picture of what it looked like, their little Saturn thing and the screen in the front. I spent a lot of time trying to find a video or a picture that was better than this, and I could not find one that didn't look like you were in the middle of Super Mario. So I don't have one. But they did do, and I'll get to this, but they did do a questionnaire later on asking how realistic they felt that this experiment was, and all the participants reported that they felt like this was an extremely realistic procedure for them. So they, in the control condition, like I said, there were oncoming vehicles coming at 35 to 40 miles per hour, with gradual increases and decreases between the cars. In the social pressure condition, they had, I loved that they were super specific on like the type of car, the red Grand Prix, that pulls up behind them and is honking aggressively. And the way that it would work is every time they pulled the lever, the honking would stop for 10 seconds. And then it would start honking again. And they had this whole, I thought it was super funny, they had this entire like analysis of like how often they would honk, and whether it would be long honks or short honks or like frequent, I don't know. But they had a whole thing that they did this entire weird interval process to make sure that it wasn't the effect of the long honk or something that was affecting the participants. So they put a little bit too much effort into this red Grand Prix. But that's basically how the task went.
So let me just see if I understand this, because I didn't read this as carefully as you did. So basically I'm sitting at an intersection out in the country. There are cars coming toward me and I'm trying to turn left, and somebody pulls up behind me and just starts honking. And cars are coming by and the honking continues until I turn, which in this study is indicated by pulling the lever, and then it stops for 10 seconds. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there and the cars are still coming. And then it starts again. So right, I have to decide if it's okay to turn. So it basically, it never really, the situation never really changes except for a few moments.
Yeah.
It changes. Okay.
That's what I gathered.
Okay.
Anyway. I know somebody had a question based on the safety of them making that turn. They didn't have any sort of crash simulation. They didn't actually, the vehicle was stationary. It didn't actually physically turn or anything like that. The pulling of the lever was solely to mark the response. So if they were unsafe and they made a turn and this car would have normally in a real situation hit them, they didn't get any sort of feedback to say that it would have hit them.
So, do you know why they didn't just have them turn and have, I mean, is there a reason why they did it like this instead of even more realistic?
You mean instead of like actually making them turn and things like that?
Well, right, because you could simulate anything in one of those
Yeah.
things. Like you could simulate them turning, and you could simulate a near miss. You could simulate a hit. You can simulate anything. Any particular reason why they did it this way?
I thought that it was kind of to control for it, because if you're getting immediate feedback of like, oh, I almost got hit, you're less likely to, you're going to be more careful after that point if you feel like you almost got hit. And I think they wanted to control for, make sure that it was solely like how close the cars were together and solely the honking that was influencing your turn and
That
not
makes
any
sense.
sort of like incoming danger. Yes.
I would think also that they would want to control for the sympathetic responses, because I know like when people almost hit me in cars, I'm like, "Whoa." You know, so that could mess with their measurements of their skin.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Well, it would mean that they were not responding to the social pressure anymore. They were responding to the near-death experience.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes.
Well, another reason they didn't have that core response was because of the motion sickness that you get
That's a really good point. That makes a lot more sense because on this next slide, motion sickness questionnaire. But
So just turning left makes people.
well, the simulation.
the simulation
it's
of like you're not
weird.
actually moving and then you turn and then you're not moving and then you turn.
Okay.
That makes a lot more
So it
sense.
wasn't like a real driving simulator in which the car also moves, like at Disneyland or Disney World. Yeah, the really good ones. There's also physical movement of the vehicle to match the visual. Say again?
I said you should rent out the rides at Disney.
Yes, they should. Yes, definitely.
Do you think I can get funding for my thesis to do that? Just take everybody to Disneyland and do this?
I'll be a subject.
Well, they had quite a few different measures. We talked about the skin conductance response already. The emotional pleasantness ratings. Okay, so they did all of these. Well, yeah, pretty much. They did all of these immediately after they did it. So the way that they did the task is they always did the control first. They didn't counterbalance it. So they always had the control condition first and then the aggressive honking social pressure condition afterwards. So after each condition, they had them do, well, this is constant, but they had them do the rest of these every time. So the emotional pleasantness ratings, they do have an analysis on that later of how pleasant or unpleasant they found the task to be. The intensity, how intense the actual simulation and the actual task was. Motion sickness questionnaire, thank you for that, because that makes a lot more sense. Mostly I figured that motion sickness questionnaire, in my little notes, I thought it would interfere with the skin conductance response. So if you're reporting a lot of motion sickness, I figured, maybe this is, and you also have a really high skin conductance response, it might interfere with that. That was my original thought, but I like your example better. And a driving simulator experience questionnaire, which I already talked about, being how realistic was this experience for you? Did you actually feel like you were driving in a car, or were you just pulling a lever because you wanted to leave? And then the Beck anxiety inventory, which they actually don't mention again in the article, which I found was a little bit weird. But I figured that was also to go in conjunction with the skin conductance response and the intensity and emotional pleasantness. I just figured that was more of kind of something to aid on to that, but they really don't talk about it again in the article, which I would have really liked to see some sort of response on anxiety inventory. So the results for the decision making. This is one of the tables that they had in the article. It took me a long time to figure out their like weird sets of analysis. So they, from the 10 responses, each participant had to give 10 responses, they took 3 of them. They took the smallest gap that they pulled the lever for, so which was usually, I think, 3 seconds. This is one participant's data right here. They took the smallest gap that the participant pulled, so like 6 seconds, for example. Is it 6 seconds? 6 seconds, yeah. 4, or this one's 7. That they pulled every time there was a 7, for example, second interval. At more than 50% of the time, the participant pulled the lever. It's a little bit hard to explain. So every time there was a 7-second gap, at least 50% of the time the participant pulled the lever, and that was considered the smallest gap. Or if it was 6 seconds. Does that make sense? It's a little bit hard
It's
to
kind
explain.
of like the average size of the gap that they thought was safe, or the size of the gap that they thought was safe at least half of the time.
Yeah, but it was the smallest possible response that they every time it popped up, at least half the time when it popped up, they took it.
Right,
That's
that's
their point. Yeah.
I said that in different words,
Oh,
but that's what I was.
I think I
trying to
confuse
say.
myself thinking about this experiment sometimes. And then the smallest gap that the participant always said was safe to go. And for this one, this particular person said it was 8. Every single time there was at least 8 seconds in between gaps in the cars, the participant took it. And so that was considered their smallest gap that it was always deemed safe to go, where the response rate was 100%. So the smallest gap that was deemed safe, that very first one that I talked about, only the VMPFC group showed significant decrease in the gap size relative to the control condition. So during the social pressure condition, the VMPFC, I'm having a hard time with this word today, the VMPFC group significantly decreased the size of the gap. So it went from, like, let's say 5 seconds to 3 seconds. I don't know what the actual raw data number is. This is true for all 3 conditions. They showed a significant decrease in the gap size during the social pressure condition relative to the control condition. For the 50% section, I guess, they also had a much larger change in gap size than the other 2 groups, the brain damage control group and the neurotypical control group. The other groups, they all had some form of change. None of them were statistically significant unless they were compared to the VMPFC group, is my point. And the same thing going for the smallest gap that was always deemed safe. So overall, VMPFC participants always significantly decreased the size of their gap that they deemed to be safe. So these are graphs from the actual article. And these little stars indicate if it was statistically significant. So this is the smallest one, the very, very smallest gap that they deemed safe at least once. It didn't have to be more than once. And it was statistically, like I said, significant for the VMPFC group across the board in relation to the social. This is the red bar is social pressure, the blue bar is the control. For the rest of them, if you can, it's pretty, especially for this group, weirdly. There's really not much of a difference between social pressure and the control group for the smallest one. This is the gap. This graph's a little bit different if you haven't interpreted one of these before. But this is the gap selection change. So that's the size of the change. Or, yes. So this is the frequency or the size. I'm sorry, I'm confusing myself now. This is the change in the gap size. And this is the propensity for them to choose that gap size. I'm sorry. So this was like I said, there was a significant difference between how large the change was in the VMPFC group relative to the control groups. Kind of stumbled over that one, sorry. The emotional rating, like I said, they didn't really report anything other than the emotional pleasantness, but well, I guess the intensity, but the VMPFC group was the only one that said that the social pressure condition was significantly more intense and significantly less pleasant than the control condition. Everybody else kind of seemed to think that it wasn't really that big of a deal, or that it wasn't significantly impressing on their attitudes or their affective state. And this is just saying that exact same thing. This is the graph from the article. The skin conductance response, the initial skin conductance response was the very first 10 seconds of the experiment, of each experiment. And for the initial 10 seconds, that first time that they tested the skin conductance response, it was significantly higher for all three groups in the social pressure versus the control condition. So when they initially started hearing that honking, they initially had a bigger skin response, which, I mean, you're being honked at, and you have been honked at in this study before, so it makes sense. But the VMPFC group had a significantly higher skin conductance response than the rest of the groups. So while all of them were significantly different between the two groups, the VMPFC group also was significantly higher than these other two groups, and they also showed that the VMPFC group significantly, overall in the entire task, for the social pressure task, had a higher skin conductance response. So just while everybody else kind of baselined a little bit, here. If you look at brain damage control and the normal control group, they have that break for all of them. And then they kind of flatline together. The blue still being the control, the red still being the social pressure. And there's a little peak here, but it's not significantly different, or significantly, statistically significant. So they kind of flatline back down in everybody, which is consistent with their their intensity and pleasantness scales. So it kind of flatlines down, whereas the VMPFC group is still pretty different from here throughout the task, and it's also pretty different from the other groups of participants. And this is just the initial, how high it goes up versus these still have an increase, but this one's significantly higher than these ones. So, both of the groups in the social pressure condition said that, like I said, they said it was less pleasant than the control condition. The VMPFC group did not think that it was statistically significant. So when they did the emotional pleasantness scale in the control condition, when there was no honking, anything like that, before, initially anyway, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. So they all thought that it was less pleasant in general. The VMPFC group didn't think it was significantly less pleasant, but they had a higher skin conductance response. They rated it as significantly more intense, and they found, I feel like I just said that. Yes. Oh, right. But researchers seem to think that this has to do with a poor self-awareness, self-regulation. They don't have a good self-monitor in that sense. So while they have all of the skin conductance response, all of these other things indicating that they feel like everything's really intense, they have the numbers to show that the VMPFC group is having more trouble resisting the social pressure from the honking. But they don't think that they do, basically. They don't think that they're having a really high emotional response to this. They don't think that it's influencing them that much. So that would indicate that they are not very self-regulated. They have an impaired ability to reflect on their emotional state or their bodily state and interpret that as an affective state, or interpret that as being something that's happening in their internal environment. So that's what affect labeling, meaning being able to say, what I'm feeling right now is this. So like I said, high skin conductance response, more intense emotion, lower ability to regulate negative emotions associated with social pressure. So they have a harder time, and this goes back to what I talked about in the beginning of, they have a harder time saying, okay, my long-term goal is to make a safe left turn. But this honking is happening and it's aggravating me, and this, I'm very anxious and I'm having a hard time saying that this long-term, that I'm still focusing on this long-term goal. And it's making them have a lower resistance to social pressure. And that's all that I have.